So we're back after Christmas and we're after the election and Boris Johnson had a stonking victory. So what does that mean for Brexit? Well, that means we are leaving the European Union at the end of January. At 11 p.m. UK time, we will no longer be a member state. There are a couple of things to tie up before then. The UK has to pass the legislation, which it will probably do this week, and then the EU will vote on the same piece of legislation or the same deal at the end of January as well, and then we will no longer be a member state. What then happens is that the UK enters into what's called a transition period, which is basically a continuation of membership as far as law, money, that sort of thing is concerned. But the UK will no longer be in the political institutions. It won't have MEPs, it won't vote in the council, and it won't have a commissioner and so on. So what then happens is that the UK and the EU will both really have to decide what their priorities are in the negotiations. These things have been going on in the background for months already, but officially the EU will probably reach this agreement among themselves at the end of February. And then once they've done that, they will then talk to the UK about what's the timetable for the talks, what exactly are they going to be negotiating, because actually it's not clear yet that both sides agree on what they want to negotiate. The EU have sort of said, well, we want to negotiate an agreement on goods, and we want to negotiate a security treaty, we want to talk about data, we want to talk about financial services, fisheries. The UK side have been much less clear, at least in public. They've actually said that they probably want to be a bit more ambitious than the EU and talk about services as well. So the first task really is for both sides to sit down and say, okay, do we actually agree that we both want to negotiate the same things? Once they do, and that might not be an easy process by any means, because in the first phase, people on the pro-leave side of the argument in the UK in particular were saying, well, why are we dancing to the EU's tune? Why are they deciding the timetable? Why are they deciding what we're talking about? So I think there may be a political opportunity for Boris Johnson at this very early stage to kind of demonstrate that he's not like Theresa May. He will stand up and he won't just go along with whatever the EU want to do. But anyway, once they've agreed that, probably in early March, then the negotiations will start proper. As I said, it's not clear what actually they're going to be negotiating. There will probably almost certainly be a negotiation on goods, but actually it won't be like the first phase in the sense that there won't be just one negotiation. There'll be different sets of negotiations. So there'll be trading goods negotiation, probably a security, and then actually there are a couple of deadlines in the middle of the year that both sides have to reach as well. By the end of June, both sides have to decide whether the other set, or whether the UK and the EU's financial services are equivalent. That's quite a contentious decision. And then they also have to reach an agreement on fisheries as well. Again, politically in the UK, that's quite a big deal as well. Will Boris Johnson want to use that as an opportunity to demonstrate that he's standing up for British rights and keeping British fish and so on? It's also unclear whether that will be a long-term agreement or just a one-year agreement to tide things over. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And also the other question is, for the middle of the year, does Boris Johnson want more time? He's said so far that really he doesn't want to. He's not going to extend. But actually, when the realities of all these things that he has to negotiate are in front of him, he may change his mind. But the fact is, he has to decide by the 30th of June whether he wants to ask for another extension of the transition period. It can be extended once, and it can be extended for as long as 2 years. But as I say, there is a chance that we may not do that. If, as looks likely, we don't do that, then the negotiations on all of these things really have to be tied up by the end of the year. And by the end of the year, that means probably in November, because you have to allow time for the European Parliament also to vote on these deals. The UK Parliament probably won't vote on them, just because Boris Johnson has such a big majority now. He doesn't need really to give Parliament any kind of concessions like Theresa May did. So then we get to the end of the year. We have to ratify these deals in time. The European Parliament, I think its last sitting is in mid-December, but really they'll want to do it before that. And it's unclear whether actually there's time to do this, because the UK is also saying that it wants to negotiate a trade agreement with the US at the same time. Do we have the resources? Do we have the expertise? Are we set up to do this so quickly after being an EU member state? It's very unclear. But anyway, the plan is that we do that, and then we get to the end of December, and all being well, all deals ratified, by the 31st of December at 11 p.m, the UK will then enter these new arrangements. But it's not that simple either, because probably most likely what will happen, and what usually happens in trade agreements, is that the provisions in the deal will be phased in and the old ones phased out. So although we will enter this new agreement, it's probably likely that it will be several years before actually all the provisions are in place and we've moved into this new relationship. One of the curious things I think on the UK side so far is that it hasn't really said very much about security in particular. The EU and Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, have been talking about this quite a lot. He's talking about cooperation in terms of police and judicial cooperation, but also in terms of foreign policy and defence, and the UK being involved in those sorts of measures. I'm not sure why the government isn't talking about it. It may be that it just simply wants to depoliticise this as an issue because it thinks it's quite important. One of the things that Boris Johnson appears to want to do now is to move Brexit to the back pages of the newspapers instead of the front, and that's already happening to a certain extent. And I think maybe he'll want to just have this second phase negotiation more like a traditional set of treaty negotiations where the public don't really pay attention, politicians in this country don't really pay attention, and that he can get on with it in the background. That may give him more space to negotiate something that's a bit less combative, or negotiate in a manner that's a bit less combative, but at the same time he may see opportunities in negotiations with the EU to score political points, and it's hard to see at this point which way he'll go on that. But anyway, the second phase looks just as busy as the first phase. It's not going to be simple, it will be complicated, it will be just as intense, if not more intense, in terms of the UK government's negotiations with the EU and its officials and institutions. But what will change probably is the level of public interest and public involvement. I do think that this will fall away in terms of public interest until we get to some kind of contentious issues, like if we're negotiating with the US at the same time as the EU and we start to talk about things like food regulations, safety and those kinds of things. The final thing that the EU is going to really insist on is what they're calling level playing field measures. So this is environmental rights, consumer rights, labour rights, things like that. What they want is that the UK maintains the same level of standards more or less that it has now, and it doesn't roll back on them in order to gain a competitive advantage. They will, I think, set that up as a red line and say, if the UK isn't willing to sign up to these measures, we're not going to negotiate with you on goods in particular, because they're worried that such a big economy so close to them, deregulating, perhaps becoming more competitive economically, is a threat both to them in terms of their market, but also in terms of their values. And that's really the interesting thing about the way the EU negotiates trade deals. It's as much about projecting values as negotiating a commercial agreement. So it's going to be complicated, it's going to be contentious, it will probably be less politicized in the sense that the public will pay less attention, but it's definitely going to be very busy indeed.